Hey everyone, welcome back to Meet in the Middle and Coffee in a Cocktail Bar. I'm excited to have my pal Josh White here, who recently left us, which I was deeply hurt by, but also very excited. And so I'm going to ask you one question. There's one answer, and this will determine if we keep going forward or not, Josh. Are you a Flames fan or a Canucks fan?
Oh, Flames all the way for life.
Yeah.
Much to my emotional detriment, but I always will be a Flames fan.
Okay, good, man. I wanted to make sure. Yeah, it's going to be a tough few years, but some good pieces. I think we're rebuilding. So, man, thanks for doing this. Why don't you talk a bit about yourself for those who don't know who you are and kind of a bit about your career path?
Yeah, Josh White. Planner by profession and education. Started out in private sector consulting in Toronto at Urban Strategies. And then sort of ended up in politics by accident. Volunteered on long shot candidate Nenshi's campaign back in 2010, writing policy. And much to everyone's surprise, he won. And talked to him the following day. He said, "We have no idea what kind of staff we need, but we would like you to join us." So that's what brought me back to Calgary. I was a senior policy advisor, helping advance his policy agenda for sort of the first 4.5 years of his term as mayor of Calgary, and then I meandered again, went to the private sector, went to Dream Development and did land development there for 4 years or so. Focused on a project called Alpine Park in Southwest Calgary.
Yeah, really
cool, forward-looking edge development. That was very interesting, and then public sector came calling again. Ended up back at the City of Calgary on the approval side first, doing reforms there, and then in the city and regional planning role. And so, led work there around new offsite levy and growth strategy and transforming our regional planning approach. Obviously did work on the housing strategy as well from the planning department's point of view, leading things like the citywide rezoning.
Yeah, fiery subject.
Yeah, not controversial at all. Well, I'm sure we'll get into that. Yeah. And then, most recently, ended up in Vancouver as the GM Planning, Urban Design, and Sustainability, what's sometimes known as the Chief Planner at the City of Vancouver.
Yeah, such a cool opportunity. I was really excited for you when that came up, and obviously a big transition and leaving the hometown here in Calgary that you've been for so long and working in. Tell me a bit about, you obviously now, I don't know if you've developed a bit of an outside perspective, but you've been in Vancouver now 2 months.
Yeah, a little over 2 months.
Yeah. How's that reflection been? Like, obviously, two different cities. Like, you're obviously exploring the fabrics and kind of what are some of the observations that you've had with your time here and your time so far there? Obviously, I know it's been short, but I think getting out of this city often gives you an opportunity to reflect on the work that you've done and kind of what you've seen.
Yeah, I think one of the first things I've observed was, like, organizationally, like, big city, municipality, Vancouver, City of Calgary, there was actually a lot more similarities than there were differences in kind of how the organization ran and how it was structured. And some of those things felt very familiar to me. But certainly the context and the market is just so different between the place. I think, notwithstanding some of the pressures that have happened in Calgary around affordability and things like that, it's just still in a completely different stratosphere to a place like Vancouver. And so looking back on Calgary should not take for granted the fortunate position it still remains in terms of its relative affordability of income to housing cost, and really to keep doubling down on supply and affordability and diversity of housing to maintain that competitive advantage. Because once it's gone, it's very difficult to get back. Vancouver, obviously, a very different situation, very different. It's a bigger metro area, has very acute affordability issues. The ways in which we're addressing affordability and affordable housing are quite different. And so, looking back on Calgary, certainly need to take advantage of that competitive advantage over time and not take that for granted. The second thing, too, is just, Calgary's processes work really well, right? Calgary's done a really good job over time of making things work and things generally move. There's always improvement to do, but certainly reflecting back, like just really appreciating how good, the city and the industry is good at working together towards solutions to make the system work. And despite difficulties, keep that approach because it's going to result in the best outcomes.
Yeah. And it's interesting, like when I think about the two cities, like Vancouver, obviously regionally constrained. And so the type of urbanism that you're working on there is a lot of what, we do in the Beltline or downtown here. Yeah. You're looking at high growth, where I know in Calgary, it's a balance between this idea of new growth. And so as one of the things that I've always been challenged with Vancouver about is it's just foreign to me when I walk around and there's buildings everywhere on every corner. And, when we talk about urbanism here, how do you meet the street? How do you walk around? How do you feel safe? How have you kind of like started to like change your mindset or like change your approach and start to get more ingrained in that type of typology? Off camera, you were just talking about meeting with like, Ian Gillespie, who's an incredible developer who's built some incredible buildings. And so, yeah, tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, it's a very different, Calgary's one of the more challenging places to plan. There's a lot of advantages to having a unicity model, to be sure. Mm-hmm. But one of the challenges is you're dealing with downtown development and beltline development and inner city type development and industrial development and greenfield development, and you even have rural parts of the city sometimes you're dealing with, and everything.
Everybody wants a piece. Yeah.
So it's highly complex. You're dealing with a multitude of problems. Certainly a city like Vancouver, the shift has been, it's a self-contained municipality within a larger region, right? Yeah. It's the central municipality of a larger region. So you're dealing with fewer typologies, but different types of challenges that come along with that. Certainly the scale of development, the affordability challenges that confront, just completely different land and cost basis to try and make sure that development can continue to proceed, different challenges and issues working with community, all those sorts of things. So it's definitely different, but it's been exciting and interesting to kind of shift towards a little bit of a different focus from the types of planning I was doing here in Calgary.
Yeah, fascinating. I guess before we get into some of the Calgary specific and middle, and now I can ask you really bold questions because you're on the outside, you give your colleagues a hard time. But again, thinking about Vancouver, for me, the two things that obviously come to mind is affordability and safety. Like, I don't know if that's what people are thinking about, but like housing affordability continues to be a challenge is from, externally what I'm seeing. And how are you seeing, like, what are some of the things that you think you're going to be able to bring to this role that can maybe address those? And am I right and wrong in thinking that safety is a concern for a lot of folks? And
I think like public safety, like every big Canadian city, like, and especially when you're the central municipality in a big city, like a lot of challenges and issues land in the central municipality. And so dealing with those, confronting those issues, very long-standing and historic issues and very concentrated and severe issues of public safety and public health issues and homelessness in areas like the downtown east side. And the impact of that is certainly something that happens there. But I think, one of the things certainly one of the reasons why I went there and some of the things I want to bring from Calgary is some of the things that, as I mentioned, work quite well in Calgary and that places like Vancouver can learn from. Vancouver's system has worked a certain way for a long time. A lot of it was predicated on a very robust market. And some of those market challenges are starting to come to bear, where we're hitting a bit of a wall in terms of levels of affordability, in terms of levels of cost. The province has certainly come in with legislation that induces the city of Vancouver to think very differently about how its process works. And so part of what I want to bring is some experience to help transition that model to work, to improve our approval system so it works faster. I think Vancouver has a reputation of being a bit slow and sticky in its approvals process
and expensive
because of how it works and expensive. Heavily negotiated type process and shifting that more towards zoning more of the city for what we want. Less negotiation based, a little bit more predictable, certainly a process that works at more speed. Mm-hmm. And that's not the way it's worked in Vancouver for a long time. So bringing some of that outside in experience because I think the future of how some of those systems work will more closely resemble how cities like Calgary and others work in the future. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of will to make that change, but finding the way and to implement that type of change is part of what I hope to bring to that job based on some of my experience in places like Calgary.
Is there like growth? I'm sure there is, but maybe do you know the numbers, like the growth targets? Like we have the MDP, like whatever that talks about growth targets. Does Vancouver have targets that they're trying to hope that they think are reasonable to achieve? And does that include like a certain amount of affordable housing units?
Definitely, yeah. Okay. We just brought forward our housing strategy, for instance, and some housing targets that are very fine-grained in terms of breaking down like overall population change. Vancouver moving from a city of 700,000 through our Vancouver plan, eventually to a city of 1 million, municipality of 1 million people or so. And then, very, very specific housing targets by tenancy, by type, looking at seniors housing, looking at co-op housing, looking at rental versus ownership, looking at below market rental, looking at deeply subsidized social housing. We have very detailed targets and a lot of tools. One of the interesting things about Vancouver is it's a charter city. Okay. It has a lot of latitude to implement kind of innovative tools to bring affordability. Cool. And it's a delicate balance between, making sure that we continue to make sure market development is viable, but understanding that market development has a stronger role to play in delivering below market rental and things like social housing in that municipality than in almost any other municipality in Canada. Because
of the land constraints specifically? Is that what?
There's land constraints, but also understanding just given the level of challenge and affordability, bringing all the tools to bear so that we can make sure that people at moderate income can exist in the city of Vancouver. But also understanding that there's a delicate balance to strike that if we push too far, we risk making market housing infeasible. So trying to work closely with our industry colleagues and internally to make sure that balance is struck and we're able to achieve both outcomes at the same time. Not an easy task, but I think it's what is necessary to happen.
I love that and I think that model should exist for every municipality across the country, because I think oftentimes we have planners and administrations that maybe don't understand the unit economics as well as the industry does. And I think it's always about that collaborative effort. And I think you're being forced to figure out and understand the depths of what a pro forma looks like, what profitability looks like, how do we create housing. But I don't think that's necessarily speaks true to every city and every municipality. And then developers are often not willing to share, but I think in that market, they don't have a choice.
It happens, we do. Yeah. We open the books and talk to each other about what the realities of land costs are, input costs are, what the costs of these things are, and understanding that the market is very dynamic. What's true today in Vancouver in its market is nothing close to what was true even 5 years ago in the market. So we do have to be nimble. We have to be adaptive. We have to be flexible enough while still advancing those goals.
It's funny that you say that, because that's what always made me nervous about these ideas of like the local area plans being kind of set in stone. I actually remember, me, you, and Gurbir were having a coffee and we talked about like, is citywide rezoning plausible? And you're like, I don't know. I can't imagine that day. And I was like, and Gurbir was like, I don't know either. And when it happened, I was like, wow, this is super cool. Because for me, it was like forward thinking, right? Like we all knew that it was right. We just didn't know if it could politically get the wherewithal or the administrative or the building codes, like we were talking about, support. Yeah. And so there's so many layers to unpack. And so it's fascinating, how one change can create this micro change and this macro change. And that's where I'm always fascinated by like turning levers slightly to make things happen. And so, I think in BC, one of the things that's been really interesting for me to watch, like, is how involved the provincial government is within the housing portfolio. Yeah. The leadership that they've taken and to change policy. And, we've been fortunate enough to work with the City of Kelowna. We just helped them launch their first 5 pre-approved prototype plans, building permit within 10 business days, like groundbreaking stuff. I wanted to talk to you about middle housing because that's where we're at. What do you see as the future for middle in Vancouver? And maybe before you even get into that, I talk a lot about this Harlan Bartholomew, his impact in Vancouver and across North America. Des was kind enough to share some info with me way back. Des Bleek, a planner here in the city. Do you see that playing out, like, that preservation of single family homes in Vancouver and how there is an opportunity for middle? Can it scale? And maybe what does that look like for you in a city like Vancouver?
Yeah, a lot of cities, a lot of visitors' experience with Vancouver is, they go downtown or False Creek or Olympic Village or something like that. And it is very dense. It is very urban. But there is a pretty large proportion of Vancouver that has stayed relatively low scale, single family, across the geography of the city. And more recently, obviously, through multiplex changes as recently as last year, that idea that we need to enter the space of more middle housing has become more prevalent. Through the Vancouver plan and things like that, there's even more push towards an increasing diversity, kind of at that higher scale of what you call middle, like that sort of 6-story apartment form, in addition to ground-oriented middle density forms. So I've always been a very, as you know, and as I advocated through things like the housing strategy, is that we need diversity of housing across the entire continuum. We can't have these gulfs between single and semi-detached houses and high rises and nothing in between. Yeah. In a city like Vancouver, I think certainly there's a strong, I believe there's still a very strong role to play. There's still a market place for ground-oriented row houses, townhouses, multiplexes.
Stacks.
There's people who want that. And in the absence of that, that's going to create some challenges in the market in terms of how the market filters, right? If you just don't provide that product, it just means those people are taking up other types of products they otherwise wouldn't, right? And you're creating shortage. Yeah. But I would say, and Calgary, Vancouver, others, it's not the panacea. Like row housing, townhouses, you also need, I think, more, especially low-rise apartment forms in much higher volume across the geography of the city. For sure. And so, for example, in Vancouver, we did multiplex in Vancouver. We have lots of places like Broadway Plan downtown that are more high-rise oriented. There's just not a lot of places in policy that are heavily enabling of that kind of low to middle scale apartment as well. And so things like what we call neighborhood centers and villages in the Vancouver plan that we're going to be implementing also help fill that gap. So what you'll have is there'll always be single detached houses that exist. You'll have multiplex as of right, kind of in the areas a bit further away from rapid transit and things like that. And then as transit service levels increase, the scale will commensurately increase with more 6-story as of right and more kind of 12 to 14-story as of right. And then obviously all those other places in Vancouver we're familiar with that have a lot of high-rise development as well. And if we do that, then you have the whole continuum. And middle density has a crucial role. We can't have that missing still in the continuum, or else the system of housing won't work as optimally as we want it to.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think you and I were talking a bit off the camera about how, we started middle with the goal of figuring out what are the constraints. How do we start to kind of alleviate those constraints along the journey? Because as a developer, scaling middle housing is always going to be challenging, right? Because you got to find one lot, go through the process, go through the zoning. The timelines have been unpredictable. There isn't a solid trade base because it wasn't as of right. No one wants to wait around for you. But I think I was saying to you how there's a bunch of these homeowners that are feeling alienated. They're in opposition. They're often kind of painted with this idea that they're NIMBYs. But for me, it's been less about that. And I know that conversation has kind of, unfortunately, been the one that is now taking the limelight. But in reality, I think those folks just want a place to stay within their community. And that's why I've always been excited about middle. And I guess the question to you, Josh, would be do you envision a way for us to, work with homeowners to age in place and be able to do this themselves? Because like you and I talked about, they've been there the longest. They control the land value. And if they see the value in creating housing for themselves and others, this opportunity could be tremendous.
I think that's part of the exciting part of this. I think more and more homeowners are starting to see how they can participate in the upside of this, both in terms of financially and how they participate and the upside for them, but also in their future for them and their kids and their families and things like that. And we talked about scale. One of the ways to scale housing is to open up new pools of capital, right? Different pools of capital, different trade pools, things like that. If it's only large institutional investors, we're actually constraining ourselves. And so that's another exciting opportunity to scale. And I think, seeing is believing for a lot of these owners. In any kind of change like that, there's a fear of the unknown. There's all sorts of unknown things. But once it starts to happen, people understand it might not be as scary as they think it is, and they start to understand how they could actually participate and what it can mean for them personally and financially. That's how it can you can start to overcome some of those changes, and I think that's what we're experiencing.
It's mobilizing a new sector is kind of how I looked at it. Like, we need to activate, like you said, every piece that we possibly can in order to solve this problem 100%. Across the country. And I feel like that you're aligned in that messaging in terms of how we do that. I guess maybe, talk about the two cities. So obviously, what do you think, if you were to say why you think Calgary still has good upside, what would you say you're most excited about where the future of Calgary could go? And then we can finish off about Vancouver, what you're looking forward to there.
Yeah, when we were going through the housing strategy, what's exciting is, the cost basis for land is still very reasonable. And we have kind of a unique, like in Calgary, very uniquely conducive land base to redevelopment. Right? That sort of ubiquitous 50 by 130 foot lot works really, really well for that type of thing. It's regular shapes. It's got lanes. There's just so much untapped potential. And if we can unlock that pool of housing, Calgary will be at a much more advantageous position to maintain its competitiveness as a place. And then, as Calgary transitions from, I've always viewed Calgary as a place that is changing from a big, small city to a small, big city. And that sounds just like a clever turn of phrase, but it means a lot. Or it means a mentality shift to growing up and becoming a bigger city. I think Vancouver had that, at a similar point in its history. Back in, after Expo 86, it was kind of a very similar size to what Calgary is now. And I grew up. Calgary, Vancouver still has a lot of growing up to do as well. But Calgary's at a very interesting historical inflection point where it's becoming that big city. And that can mean a lot of upside in terms of its urbanism and its change and all those sort of things. And because it hasn't lost its level of affordability, it has every opportunity to be find that sort of sweet spot where it can become a great, big, livable urban city, but also one that's affordable and attainable and inclusive for more people. And so I know the civic leaders here are heavily focused on that and working with, the development industry. It can be achieved.
Cool. Yeah. And what about Vancouver?
Yeah, Vancouver, also I think, at an interesting and exciting point in its history, going through a lot of change. Definitely a lot of opportunity. As I mentioned before, it's had a growth model that's been more, I would call, focused in very specific geographies and places to great success. I mean, its transformation of its downtown has been, globally leading in its success, right? Lots of success there. It has a similar opportunity to do that type of very positive urban transformation across more of its city, and using that more distributed growth model, that more inclusive growth model across more of the city to allow itself to become a more inclusive and a relatively affordable city using the tools it has. And so, lots of opportunity to really improve the way Vancouver is. One of the things I found interesting there is I just sent out a tweet yesterday about, the future in Vancouver is really, I think it's really about transit, right?
Yeah.
And it's already got an exceptionally strong backbone of a transit system through TransLink.
Yeah.
And leveraging that really strong transit unlocks that ability to grow in the kind of way I'm talking about, where, we've eliminated parking minimums. We can unlock this type of housing supply, middle housing. So much is possible without the burden of having to provide so much parking. Right. And because there's a strong transit system, we can execute that growth model. Vancouver, over 1.1 million transit trips per day, equal to, so of the 9 metro areas in the United States that are of of a very similar size, 2.5 million to 3.5 million people. Vancouver has more transit trips per day than those 9 cities combined. 26 million people across cities like Tampa and San Antonio and Charlotte and Portland and St. Louis and Baltimore, all within that same size of Vancouver. But Vancouver starting from such a position of strength to grow into that great livable big city because it has such a strong transit system and mobility system that can support that.
Yeah. Fascinating. Man, that's a crazy stat.
Yeah.
Good one to end on. Well, Josh, man, I'm super excited to see you here back in Calgary. Obviously, we'll be following your journey. I'm excited to see the changes, challenges, and everything that comes at you from Vancouver. And hopefully you can help scale middle housing there and figure out how to support some of those groups there to kind of help I know small housing BC, and there's so many good people doing the work in British Columbia as well.
So important to the future of Vancouver and British Columbia.
Yeah, I'm stoked. Okay, well, thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Sal.